Hey guys, Wordup here after what could only be described as an excessive hiatus to talk about something a bit different from what I would usually do on this channel. The reason for my break is, as many can assume, I've just been playing Legion since there's just so much to go out and do. It becomes quite overwhelming as a player like me who likes to get a taste of a lot of different classes, so apologies for leaving all of you hanging. Now, excuses aside for uploads, as is common with people on YouTube, this is more of an existential video about how well Mythic Plus has gone as an alternate content compared to the traditional endgame PvE system that is raiding, and will probably feature a lot more of the dreaded feelycraft than the other things that I lambast so often in Discord that you might have seen, and it's probably the most feelycraft kind of thing that you'd find me doing. On that same point, don't expect this to be the consistent type of content I'll be putting out unless it's received really well, but this does seem like a great topic to dive into given how much of my time has been consumed by either one or the other of these two areas of content in Legion. If, however, you do really like this, and this is the kind of content that you'd be interested in, I'm not arrogant enough to think that my opinion is really important, but I would be really, really appreciative for the comments below to actually get a gauge on whether this is worth doing in the future on other topics that I think are interesting. Anyway, so introductions aside, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is introduce raiding and just give a bit of a background for anyone who may not necessarily be in the same position as I am or other raiders. So as PvE players, we all know that raiding has always been the forefront of PvE once you reach the level cap. You're going to have some gear in here or there, be that through dungeons, dailies, rep grinds, or with Legion, the new constant world quests. But ultimately, if you want to punch higher, you'll be drawn into LFR and then full-fledged raids. This has always put it on a sort of pedestal as the toughest content because it had to be. That encourages players into the content, which is required, and it also then, by extension, has to provide the best gear, and in a somewhat ironic turn, also needs to be the toughest content to make use of the gear that it gives you. Because of that, it's become a bit of a feedback loop of gear plus mechanics that requires players to respect it. So when that happens, it creates a mass of resources to help less experienced players get a leg up when trying to tackle it. So that it is no longer the basic bash your head against the boss, get some gear, bash your head against it a bit more, maybe get close, eventually kill the boss. It's a tiring experience, at least for the average player. Though obviously that doesn't necessarily extend to the more hardcore scene, where that is part of the appeal of the content. These resources then manifest in guides, like many others, myself included, that you've seen on this channel here, have produced videos, strategies, endless log analysis on every kind of site you can imagine, and even the Dungeon Journal itself that they added all the way back in Cataclysm, which, unlike MMO Champions forums will tell you, did actually have some things added into it that was good. Just by existing, all of these dilute the nature of the intrinsic difficulty designed into raids, because shared knowledge ultimately reduces the barrier to entry for everyone, and it removes one of the fundamentals of encounter design, experience through failure. None of this is to say, however, and I really must stress this in case this is coming across, that any of these are bad things. A shared community that helps each other and allows for more open space for information is absolutely what has made the World of Warcraft raiding scene great for almost a decade for me at this point, and it also is kind of what keeps me involved with it, because I do like speaking to people, and getting a shared opinion is genuinely part of the whole MMO experience. Hiding information ultimately hurts the game, and it generates unnecessary competition between people who are just interested in doing one thing. That's enjoying a game that we all play and we all are a bit too much invested in sometimes. And so that's why I added this brief little introduction to raiding up until this point before I break into a full-fledged discussion on Mythic Plus, because I think there are some amazing benefits alongside some teething problems that the system has added in Legion. So Mythic Plus then has become the new alternate endgame progression path for players who may not want to invest in the large-scale and traditionally time-consuming pastime of raiding. And much like in other expansions, this is one of the many lauded features that is going to save PvE for all of those casuals, that everyone seems to only have a really polarizing experience of either love or hatred, whilst I personally am not really sure where that comes from. It is the thing. This was added to much fanfare and has been, by and large, in my humble opinion, very successful. It's provided a great way to give those uninterested in the older paradigms of endgame PvE something to aim for when they hit level cap, and an ever-increasing ceiling of difficulty to keep content enjoyable and fresh is a really interesting take, because that's something that we've never really had in the game before. The Keystone system, with difficulty that carefully ramps up with differentials between each week, is actually something I would very cautiously say would add some extra spice even to the raiding scene to keep things a bit different, but that's a much more risky discussion for much braver men than me, so I'm going to leave that well alone on the side. For all of the teething issues that Mythic Plus has definitely gone through, both before and after launch, in fact, right through the beta, and it's very easy to go back and check the forum thread that still exists now, but they went through some real stinkers over the course of them. They all ultimately, however, pale in comparison to the benefit that the system has had, and that's one simple thing. It's kept 5-man content relevant for the first expansion ever. This makes for a much more accessible pick-up-and-play endgame system, where you don't need to rely on pugs to just be able to play. You can round up a small number of players and get stuck into actually relevant content. On that merit alone, it's hard to deny that the system has been anything other than a resounding success in Legion for what it was meant to do. All the things after that are either a bonus, or just something that you have to deal with when you're playing the game. With old dungeon content, it became very quickly a fire and forget method of easing people into organised PvE in every expansion that I remember playing. A way of framing the story of a given expansion and then letting it slide quickly into irrelevance, which became abundantly clear over the course of Wrath of the Lich King, where badges became pointless early, and dungeons were effectively a daily routine without much extra to consider for that little bit of extra gear that was on the vendor as each raid tier was introduced. In some cases, additional dungeons were added, such as the ICC setup and the Troll dungeons of Cataclysm, both of which were good, and I can't deny that, but rarely, if ever, did they become something relevant to the raiding community long after the raids were released and open. That differential is the key point. The PvE community and the raiding community have always been treated as two different microcosms, when they should ultimately be in the same group, and that's people who just play PvE. That's then maybe why Mythic Plus is, to me, so special. It keeps players engaged in old content, despite it being largely a grind, whilst adding some spice to the mixture, and it also integrates groups of players that usually, after the launch of an expansion, very quickly diverge and never really interact with each other again. But now, I'm still playing with people that would very rarely still be raiding, and would have transitioned into more casual content quite regularly, which is really interesting. It also allows for players to have a feeling of accomplishment, grinding higher into that Mythic Plus ceiling, or alternatively a sense of reward just completing lower tier dungeons due to the quality of the loot given. When you combine both of these factors with the affix system, you create a great amalgamation of challenge, reward, and progress all into one big bag. That, coupled with the requirement of a reasonably organised group, has provided a lower barrier of entry for small organised groups to do something meaningful, but still feel like they're doing something relevant. Without the barrier of large-scale raiding being required for the gearing, despite raiding being very helpful in Mythic Plus, a system as effectively generated from nowhere to open the floodgates to all of those players who, despite their long-time desire to do something important, had time or group limitations stopping them from engaging in World of Warcraft's endgame, and now there's actually a system that allows for them. On a more specific and serious note, however, perhaps the most divisive thing in all of this is the emergent gameplay that has been created by group formations within the Mythic Plus system. The dichotomy of performance plus value in a group has put class balance under a microscope in the most unusual way for the first time in a very long time, which I will elaborate on in much more detail with the Keystone system. By emergent gameplay, I think it's probably fair to explain what exactly I mean. This is the kind of thing that creates different tactical approaches to challenges. Say you have a Warlock in the Archway and you want to command Demon to apply Brand of the Legion to a particularly strong DPS in the group. That is emergent. That's not the original design of the dungeon, but it alters the way you approach encounters and the route that you would otherwise not take if you didn't have access. This adds extra flavour into how a dungeon feels. No longer does your group setup decide, like in raids, whether you can kill a boss 10 seconds earlier, maybe skip a phase. Now it decides whether you want to pull a pack here or there, take a different route, or even alter the dungeon you want to aim for and do entirely. That adds player choice back into the mix, where there is no longer a fixed paradigm for how you deal with an encounter and a fixed rule for success. That diversity adds a complexity that in many ways I think is being underestimated largely by the PvE community at large, and has added untold depth to the endgame in Legion. It has also fixed one of the core problems that plagued Warlords of Draenor, and that was that there was a lot of classes that had utility, inverted commas, that never got used. Me personally, as a great example, as a shaman, I had loads of things that I never really made any use of. Now, in a dungeon, there are so many instances where things like Purge, Stun Totems, Root Totems, they all get used, and this is the first expansion in a long time that in a PvE setting this has been the case, which I really appreciate. Diluting the formula, then, to the point it is in Mythic Plus, so that you can no longer create an all-encompassing guide to how you approach it, means that the rush of encountering a challenge first is expanded to the masses instead of those who are the first to kill a boss. I personally have seen bosses before they have been spread to the public, and it's a great feeling knowing that you're trying to solve the puzzle yourself, But that's not something that a lot of people have really experienced, especially now as the raiding scene has become more important, more serious. Having group-specific situations that are time-constrained through the affix system means that everyone gets to experience that piece-by-piece progress as you orient yourself better to the situation without a guideline, and you fix the problem bit by bit as you go throughout the encounter. And then you decide from there how much further you can push it in the Mythic Plus system. This does lead on, however, at the same time to a bit of a problem with group diversity and different tactics. This has created a hierarchy much like in raiding, but in a completely separate vein. Now being the best potential DPS in an encounter is no longer enough. You need to be versatile in the dungeon you're dealing with and have extra tools to deal with mechanics. In some cases, this is fine, but when you start pushing higher keystones where you are limited by the stone itself as to what dungeon you select, more fringe cases can become glaring. As an example from before, take a warlock that does not come primed with an interrupt. More of Souls is very interrupt heavy, and missing a DPS that could deal with that mechanic adds extra burden to the group. When you could take an equally powerful shaman, this rigid keystone locked system can quickly punish a group who wants to run with the same group from beginning to end. This problem is repeated across the board. When you look at some specific dungeons, they really scream for a stun. Archway as an example straight away for me. But a mage cannot provide that, whilst say alternatively a monk could. This means that some of these dungeons can lock you out if you get them as your keystone because your group isn't tailored. I will again touch on the keystone system at the end as a much bigger section. On this, I also think that it's worth noting that the timer is perhaps one of the really great strokes of genius in Mythic Plus to me. It adds a fixed, but often quite lax endpoint to a dungeon that is finite. It makes sure that you know that if you aren't consistently beating or getting close to that timer, that you are not dealing with the dungeon like you should be. Instead of the hardline of a group wiping on a boss in a raid, this provides a projected completion ranking of sorts to your run, with enough flexibility at lower levels at least, to let you know that you could be improving without being overtly punishing and denying you any success. This also helps to prevent the raw brute force tactic that a lot of guilds have employed in the past and still do to this day in raids on some encounters, where they will simply beat their heads against the wall of a boss over and over and over again until it eventually falls over because everyone has just become so used to it. This instead rewards players for dealing with the dungeon correctly with additional rewards, and at the extreme end stops players' progress entirely if they just flood time into a dungeon trying to progress when they realistically should be thinking that that's not really the difficulty level for them. This teaches and rewards discipline and knowledge of a dungeon more than anything else when you're trying to progress, which interestingly serves perfectly for the Mythic Plus system. A player should spend as much time looking at the dungeon and where they can capitalize on their tools as they do analyzing their own play and where they can perform better as the class. This is a great way of emphasizing something that has rarely been emphasized as often as it should be, and that is that the content is the enemy when you're doing PvE, not the illusory barrier of playing your own class correctly or knowing how to play the game. Effectively, the keystone levels have created an organic LFR, normal, heroic, and mythic environment. Some dungeons are effectively identical to regular mythics at 2, and it increases in difficulty. That's a great way of integrating players into the system without an arbitrary anxiety of stepping up higher because it's titled heroic. The only problem that arises is the difficulty that harder Mythic Plus dungeons introduce are very poorly introduced to the player, and failure is exceptionally punishing, which will require you to complete the dungeon again, loot free, if you want to keep going. At this point then, I've waxed lyrical about the positives and how much I love Mythic Plus and yada yada that I'm sure everyone's heard before in various places, so I'm going to shift over to some of the more questionable or possibly negative aspects of the Mythic Plus system that have really started to arise over the time that I've been doing them. That's to start straight away with the length of the encounter. Given that Mythic Plus effectively bunches the entirety of the dungeon into one big, long, compressed encounter that can be anywhere between 10 and 45 minutes, depending on which dungeon you're doing or what exactly you're trying to do there, that amps up the variance enormously for how much pressure a group is under. Having to perform consistently in a raid, for example, usually limits itself to, at the very most, 15 minutes of consistent play. A dungeon can triple that, and the further up you go, one misstep can easily lead to the failure of the run, just like it would in a boss encounter. That pressure without checkpoints and the hot zones of hard trash can, in some cases, create a situation that encourages players to take massively unfavourable risks to make up some time and get some breathing room. The downside, of course, being that you put yourself in a really, really seriously bad situation if you fail that attempt. This ultimately leads to an excess of high-pressure situations, where a 10-minute raid fight could have 2 to 3 extremely high-stress moments. Every pull in a dungeon can be. This leads to reliance on consumables, increasing the barrier to entry, which is something that we've talked before, is something that they really succeeded on with the implementation of the system. This also can amp up group hostility in some cases because a simple mistake is the end of the run, and people have invested both time and money into doing it. A possible solution to this, though maybe the antithesis of what the Mythic Plus system is, and slightly controversial, would be some sort of checkpointing system that would let you acquire it through the dungeon to ease up some of the more extreme risks that groups can take to barely scrape by, and ease up the automatic fail problems that force groups to deplete a keystone 20 minutes deep. This isn't the first time that a system like this has kind of been used. If you look back at Shar of Fear, when you got to the second phase, you then got to speed up in the first phase, which, generally speaking, is the kind of thing that I'd be looking for. Another thing, which is perhaps my biggest personal complaint of the system, is that the keystone you receive is completely out of your hands. When it comes to the first keystone of the week, this is fine because you're just pushing through, you're experiencing the dungeon that is in your reach. You've already done that the week before. The higher this reaches, however, the more of an issue this creates because generating a 10 plus keystone will take your time, and getting a bad keystone can effectively deadlock it for the reset, making you completely unable to do it. When you combine that with different group setups that ideally want to target certain dungeons because they are oriented toward it much better, or because there are fundamental dungeon difficulty gaps due to affixes, that creates an enormous dissonance between low-scale groups and progressing groups. Fixing this could be quite easy. Allow a profession or even the blood vendor to sell an item that reforges the keystone location randomly. This will likely encourage targeting dungeons, but the next point I'm going to make shows that people already do this for loot all the time, which I can only assume is the primary reason the random keystone was implemented in the first place. So, related to that, another thing that could, in some ways, be sort of deemed as a positive is that the same one keystone lock has created the boosting culture that has emerged. Since your keystone is fixed, you have to do that dungeon if you want to progress your own keystone. Otherwise, you rely on others getting the one that you want. For lower power groups, this means that in some cases you can feel like you need others to get lucky if you get, say, a Halls of Valor key, which is arguably one of the more punishing dungeons for a general group. Relying on groups far better equipped to boost your keystone, however, to re-roll it, that means that players often interact with the dungeon as a passerby. Having people effectively complete the dungeon for them with little input and not really feeling a sense of completion or getting better, just rewards and loot, isn't ideal to me. This does, however, have a great counterpoint that it spreads the wealth of geared players, helping newer entrants into the PvE scene come up into the Mythic Plus arena. Unfortunately, because of the same issue of people wanting to target dungeons due to loot or ease of rewards, as mentioned before, that same keystone fix can again deadlock someone into never being taken to a boost group because they have an undesirable keystone. Extended from that, due to the boosting situation, actually finding a raw pug that is willing to play through a dungeon for the experience at an appropriate difficulty for them is much more difficult. Many will instead opt out and have their keystone boosted as many times as possible, especially if it is a desirable dungeon like, say, More of Souls for the AP grinders out there, and then when it becomes undesirable, they'll then attempt to find others in a pug. This creates a feedback loop of pugs that contain players that have been boosted and are doing dungeons that are considered more time consuming and difficult despite not having a lot of experience, and such alienating players from wanting to join pugs at all because they know those are the people who are in it. On the other hand, it does encourage organised play significantly more because they have the option to look for the keystones they want, because boosties will be willing to offer it up, further contributing to the pug issue that is happening. So outside of the meta discussion of the pugs, the boosts, the keystones themselves, I'd like to just note a really extreme high point for me personally that is quite anecdotal, and that is Court of Stars. There was an amazing success in the Mythic Plus system, which I do think deserves the credit that it got. And this dungeon itself, I feel with some of the extra factors, allowed some players to progress higher than they would normally have been able to due to player or gear constraints, largely due to the variables of profession, class, and race interactables. Allowing for a way to swing a dungeon in your favour due to factors other than performance, despite being RNG, which I do understand isn't super preferable, is a fantastic way of allowing for the gates to open a little bit wider and for players to feel accomplished without a simple run and gun dungeon experience getting loot at the end. This has since been removed to an extent, however, or significantly reduced, and the caveat is that the same dungeon creates the same problems. The RNG spawns of some interactables can lead groups to become dependent on them to succeed. This can feel overly punishing and dilute the experience in the opposite direction. Some middle ground between this would be great, and expanding on the ideas in this dungeon would be an amazing way of encouraging people to push harder without necessarily meeting strict performance checks. Anecdotally, seeing groups of players in my own guild going out of their way to change professions to deal with potential spawns for a more favourable dungeon is great to see, as it means there is an extra avenue of success outside of raw gear and play, and I think that could be expanded on greatly in the profession system already. So moving on to the big one, and this is the last big thing, is the affix system for Mythic Plus, which, whilst being a great system, has had more than a bumpy road, and I'm sure everyone has had that week that's felt like death to do dungeons in. When some affixes are effectively relegated to meme status, and others are free AP farm week, then that definitely can cause a disconnect to some, especially those who are doing it as a consistent source of content as opposed to filler in between their raids. I feel the largest benefit of the system is, as said already, the ways in which it changes your approach to a dungeon. Bolstering and Necrotic are two affixes that, whilst some people may find it quite irritating, are easily two of the best designed because they directly hinder your usual run and gun approach of a dungeon. On the other hand, both of the plus 10 affixes provide flat increases that are mostly arbitrary gates to block further progress based on gear, those being tyrannical and fortified. There is some middle ground with effects such as volcanic and raging. Then there are some of the more obnoxious affixes that simply are an unpleasant experience, such as teaming, that can sync far too well with some of the other affixes that are already quite good, and just dilute the experience. Whether any of this can legitimately be fixed or not is a question far above my pay grade, I think, because it has become quite entrenched in the design, and I'm just a player. New affixes such as bursting coming along in the future I think definitely have a place in the design space, as it will directly impact your dungeon approach. But some of the affixes that already exist, in particular I'm going to call out teaming and skittish, I feel have done the damage by being in the rotation from the start. Overflowing is another problem point, given that it is virtually irrelevant to most groups from my experience, and has regularly been involved in the free AP farm week jokes about combinations when it finally comes around. One final thing that is separate from all of this is that I think the hardline of fixed breakpoints could perhaps scale to ease players in. Instead of, for example, a level 4 bolstering being added for 20% increase upon death, make a 4-5%, a 5-10%, and then at 6 you get the full 20% experience, and that lasts for the remainder of your climb, to ease players into the mechanic as they go. The instant addition of a full-fledged mechanic that can be extremely punishing to a player, I imagine, is very jarring, and having a steady introduction to it as they climb would allow for more grace, especially given that the overriding gain from these dungeons is the AP rewards that do not change outside of the affixed tier jumps. And last but absolutely not least, I'm sure to many, is the colossal issue that has grown out of Mythic Plus gearing. This is like a 4 or 5 layered issue that completely understanding the impact of it is really hard for anyone because of how far reaching it can be. Having the sheer wealth of different gearing options in Mythic Plus that in many cases are better for specific specs than that available in raids, adding in the Titan Forging system coming into play, that can be really jarring for those who have actually played for a while. This is put under a major microscope with trinkets and relics that specifically can end up significantly better than alternatives that you can get from large-scale organised raiding and PvE, and that alone I think is very problematic for 2 reasons. First, the reward of raiding being gear to defeat the content, as I said earlier, is undermined because now you need to be doing extracurricular activities to keep yourself relevant outside of just the raw AP grind, which in itself is not a huge issue. But secondly, however, that the item level is dictated entirely by the Warforging and Titan Forging system creates an unpleasant RNG experience. Even if you target a dungeon repeatedly, you still may not get the item you want no matter how much you try. Generally speaking, there are items historically from raids that have been defining, just like some of the items that you will get in Mythic Plus, but drop rates dictate from bosses that it will eventually drop since that's the nature of loot tables because you're killing it so frequently and you're targeting it. But will that Memento of Angerboda drop when it's got a 1 in 30 chance to actually land? And will it Titan Forge all the way up to 895 and get a socket? That's anyone's guess, but most likely, as I'm sure you've all experienced, the answer's no. Fixing this at this point though is really difficult because it's intrinsic to the reward system of Mythic Plus. These again were issues that were brought up in the beta and have unfortunately, with absolutely no smugness because I'm really sad that it did, reared their head. Ideally, I'd rather see the Obliterum Forge used a bit more to allow players a little bit more control over items they want to bring up outside of just professions. Maybe perhaps being able to obliterate items that you get from Mythic Plus to ramp up the trinkets or relics that you really, really want to target, just to reduce that triple layered RNG that comes with items such as trinkets and relics, needing not only the keystone for the dungeon, but for the item to drop, which is rare in itself, and then for it to Titan Forge a ludicrous amount to put it in the range of what you really want if you're raiding. I think the best comparison is how the new legendary item that is being implemented in 7.1.5 is being done, because it allows players to upgrade the item level of specific legendaries they either like or they need to stay relevant, up to the item level that is going to keep them powerful. That's the kind of thing that Mythic Plus should in some way allow, through a gated progression system, because really the constant grind is becoming quite exhausting. Okay, so this video has been, I don't even know how many months in the making, because I've been somewhat worried about doing something different to what I normally do, and the aforementioned actual Legion grind took so much out of me. So if you made it to this point, I 100% appreciate you taking the time to listen to just some guy's opinion on Legion PvE. If it's genuinely the type of content you'd enjoy more from me, I would absolutely love feedback in the comments, and if you agreed with it, even more so, like and share to anyone, because opinions would be super appreciated from even the people who don't like me anyway, even if it's just brutally honest, because I can take it, trust me. Thanks for watching, and for the first time in a while, and I hope without as much of a break next time, I'll see you in the next video.